Welcome to this episode of the Psychedelic Mom Podcast. This is part 2 of a 2-part series of a conversation that I had with my colleague and friend, Stefanie Cohen. And if you haven't listened to part 1, it's episode number 70. And Stefanie and I talk about who are we and how we were called to this path of psychedelics and the question of who gets called to this path. And she leaves us on a bit of a cliffhanger. Stefanie was a journalist for the Wall Street Journal and on many SSRIs, suffering from anxiety, depression, was pretty much miserable. And she ended up leaving her job and suddenly finding psychedelics. The cliffhanger is she is about to head to Tijuana to experience ibogaine at a clinic that is mostly supporting heroin addicts and people with addiction. But she traded her writing skills for ibogaine treatment. So we head to Tijuana with Stefanie. And we also talk on this episode of different medicines, ayahuasca, mushrooms, 5-MeO-DMT, and what medicines have taught us and what we're still trying to learn. Where are we on this path? We talk about ego disillusionment and non-duality. So I want to just kind of talk a little bit about what I mean when I talk about non-duality and why this topic has become so interesting to me. As you know, I mentioned on the Psychedelic Mom Podcast, we're going to be expanding our conversation from psychedelics to biohacking to optimization and really looking at all the things that we need to live a psychedelic life, a soul-revealing life, a life aligned to our true nature. Also, I want to highlight here that Stefanie talks about getting off of her SSRIs on her own, going kind of cold turkey. I definitely don't recommend that. And everything discussed on this show is meant for entertainment use. This is not to be taken as medical advice or recommendations. You always need to check with your doctor on everything, including psychedelics, and also check where psychedelics are legal. This is not a recommendation of use of psychedelics due to their widespread illegality and complexity. So again, do your homework and find out if you are looking to do any of these medicines, where you can do them legally and how you can be supported in a way that would support your journey. In this conversation, we end with non-duality, which has become a topic that is really fascinating to me. And if you've been on a psychedelic path or a meditation path or a path of trying to awaken to your true nature, I think at some point you're going to come across non-duality. Many people who experience psychedelics have what is considered an ego disillusionment and have an experience of unitive state, of something that is indescribable, inseparable than us. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it here because I want to just clarify what I mean when I'm talking about non-dual. If you haven't had a chance to listen to my episode with Dr. Angelo DeLula, his episode is episode number 33. And I have an episode with Frank Yang, which I find absolutely fascinating. He has reached the highest level of enlightenment for Theravada Buddhism. And I have done some coaching sessions with Frank Yang, and I am currently putting together a video of some coaching sessions that I've done with some non-dual teachers, getting into kind of the deeper nitty-gritty of disillusionment of self. Sound fun? Well, just think Dark Night of the Soul. So what do I mean by non-dual? Non-dual was originally derived from a Sanskrit word, Advaita Vedanta, which means non-dual and not two. And it was meant to be a direct pointing to this realization of unitive nature, of true nature. That being said, most of what you hear about when you hear non-duality, non-dual, they're referring to more a contemporary tradition of Neo-Advaita. When you're hearing non-duality in kind of pop culture and the pop spiritual culture, there's kind of a language around it, and it's a gathering of people in groups and holding what is called satsang, which is a direct transmission from teacher to student, or it's a direct participation in a group of living undivided truth. So when I am referring to non-duality, I'm referring to a way of a specific perceptual insight that we all have. It's kind of being blocked by our mind and some would call solidities, our conditionings. I'm really speaking of a deeper stage of realization, or how reality looks when a certain perceptual filter has dissolved. This typically happens after an initial awakening. And I know many of us on the psychedelic path and yogic path, or a path of optimization, have definitely had awakening experiences. And certainly on the psychedelic path, we can be fooled in thinking that these psychedelic awakenings are full realization. And they're not. Full realization goes way, way, way deeper. And yet we're already there. Awakening is awakening itself up, and awakening always exists. There's always this fully alive, non-dual reality that is right here, right now. It's intimate, it's spontaneous, it's free-flowing, it's radically ungraspable and not tangible and radically intimate. And so I have had the experience of the non-dual. I have touched it many times. I had a month of fully living in the non-dual experience, and now my solidities have come back, which basically means there's more for me to let go of. There's aspects of myself that are still perceiving separation. So I'm in this process of full realization of the end of suffering, Buddha nature, Christ consciousness. What I'm realizing, besides some dark nights of the soul and dissolving of many aspects of who I am, it requires subtle and more subtle investigations of how I perceive the world, how I perceive myself as separate. Frank Yang put out a really interesting video recently that really talks about any suffering, shame, blame, separation. It's all happening within us. Our mind is so fast, puts on a filter so fast. Josh Putnam gave me some wise advice recently, which was listen to people until you're hearing them. He was referring to my children. Sometimes there's some clunky things as a mother, and I'm in the midst of that, amidst of some changes in my life that have created some deeper need for investigation of my relationships with my children. He said, listen until you become them. It's like, listen to the degree. And Frank Yang mirrored that sentiment by saying, like, there's no one reality. There's as many realities as there are minds. To fully allow someone else's reality without the need to defend or to do anything. So this non-dual is really about unconditioned, unbound love, but it's really about a way of seeing reality that is not how we normally see reality. I'll be exploring this more and more deeply, how psychedelics, in particular 5-MeO-DMT, can help with the deeper stages of realization and help with the solidities that we have. But I do not have the answer to that yet. So I'm in this process, and I will bring you along. And Stefanie is in this process as well. We're all in this process, by the way. The process that isn't a process, and we're all on this path that is not a path. It's always right here. And me even thinking that I'm not there is just a filter of the mind. So welcome to this episode of the Psychedelic Mom Podcast, as we explore these deep, deep questions that live in all of us. The deep wounds that we do have is the original wound of separation. And we are back on the Psychedelic Mom Podcast. This is episode number 2, where I sat down with my friend and colleague, Stefanie Cohen, to talk about psychedelics, our path, how we got here, who we are, and where we're headed. We discuss who is called to this path. Today, we'll be discussing different experiences that we've had, ego disillusionment, and one of my favorite topics, non-duality, and what it really means like to move from psychedelic experiences of ego disillusionment to living a life that is non-dual. So welcome today. This is episode number 2 of a 2-part series that I did with my colleague, Stefanie Cohen and friend. So if you haven't listened to part 1, definitely listen to episode number 70, where we leave you at a cliffhanger when Stefanie was headed to Tijuana. And here we're going to start with that. And Stefanie, welcome. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me in your West Coast office.
Yeah.
Psychedelic Mom.
You know, I don't often get to interview people in person and live, so this is so nice. So if you notice that we're not looking at the cameras, it's because Stefanie is here in my studio with me. So I'm happy to have you here.
I'm so happy to be here.
So you left us last time, headed to Tijuana, to a clinic that was mostly used for addiction, and there were a lot of people there who were suffering from heroin addiction. You were suffering from years of anxiety, some depression, just madness from working in the industry in New York of journalism with Wall Street Journal, and had really had a lot of experience with SSRIs, many different SSRIs, and was still feeling like you were suffering. And so somehow you ended up meeting somebody who called you down to Tijuana to do an article and a trade. So tell us about this experience and where that led you in life.
Yeah, so I think when I was talking on the last podcast, I was describing how I wouldn't talk to any of the other people in the clinic, and I was just keeping myself very separate. I was just anxious, and I didn't want to associate with people that had used heroin, and I was really different, and I was a journalist, and meanwhile they were all like, okay, whatever, she's just as miserable as we are. But they were waiting for me to kind of have the treatment, which is ibogaine, which is like a synthesized version of iboga. And they were so cute. Like the morning that I was going to do it, you're hooked up to a heart monitor and an EKG, and there's a nurse there and an EMT, I think. It's a pretty big deal in case you have something happen with your heart.
I just want to pause here too for anybody who doesn't know what ibogaine is. Ibogaine is one of the alkaloids that comes from the iboga tree, which is a tree from Gabon, Africa, where iboga is is the sacramental medicine for the Bwiti. And ibogaine was synthesized back in the 1900s, actually, was the first time we hear of it. And then brought to the United States, and realized that it was good for addiction through Howard Lotsof. And it's so weird. He just found out accidentally.
Yeah, he was a heroin user. And then someone was like, oh, I have a new drug for you to try, I think is how it went.
A chemist friend handed it to him. So for anybody who doesn't know what ibogaine is, I just wanted to give you that brief history here, that now it's being used in a clinical setting for heroin addiction, optimization,
psychospiritual.
Mm-hmm.
And I had been invited down there by the guy who ran the clinic, who told me it also can be used for depression and as a psychospiritual medicine. But most people know of it as being used for addiction because one of the alkaloids, I think, works on the same receptors as the opioid receptors. So you don't go into withdrawal. Those receptors that are craving heroin or morphine, opiates, get the ibogaine, so they get blocked. So they feel like they're getting what they need. This is a very probably not scientific description, but you don't go into withdrawal, essentially. So I was given this amazing gift of being given this treatment, which is a really big deal. As I said, there's staff there to ensure your safety. And that morning, I hadn't spoken to anyone in the clinic, literally. I was ignoring everyone. And they all were at the door when I went in. And they were like, good luck. Like, we can't wait to see how you do it when you come back. They were so sweet. Yeah, so I took 3 pills of ibogaine, and had the most insane night of my life. It was the most bizarre experience. It was like a movie of my life, starring me, directed by me, produced by me. I was the audience and the critic. Like, it was me going through all these different scenarios that looked so incredibly real. It wasn't like trippy visuals. It was like I was there in a movie with other people coming in and out, having all these wild encounters. It lasted hours and hours and hours. I laid completely stock still the entire time. Like, oh my God, this is so demented and so fabulous and so bizarre.
And were the scenes, you keep using the word bizarre, were the scenes themselves familiar, like
No,
familiar to your life?
no, there were these like gauntlets I had to go through. And a lot of people, I must have encountered 1,000 people that night. I had no idea who any of them were. But what was interesting is, as you said, it's an African medicine. There were these African women throughout the journey that I would encounter like at really difficult moments that would look me in the eye, and they weren't like, "Hey girl, you're good." They were kind of like serious and knowing, but reassuring in their like, they weren't like hugging me or like, being warm, but I felt their presence, that they were watching over me the whole time. And they kind of were like the keepers of the medicine, sort of guiding me. And it was, there were some pretty gnarly moments in that, experience. But what the main part, I won't get too into it because it's so personal and wouldn't be interesting, but is when I felt the medicine wear off at the very end. I sat up. I had, my heart monitor and my EKG on, but I sat up like stock straight, and I didn't have like a single thought in my head. It was like entirely clear for the first time in my life. There was no anxiety, no neurosis, no questions. It's like the first time I'd ever really felt that. And it was
just silence, no thought.
Yeah. And so how I would describe what happened, just in general terms, is that like ayahuasca, how I see it, kind of like pinpoints specific moments or things or behaviors, or illuminates various discrete things in your life for me. But what ibogaine does is like fire hose the entire ego structure down. Like, it doesn't pick and choose. It just wipes the whole thing clean for a little while. For like a period afterward, there's a lot of like, who am I and why do I do these things and why did I do these things and where did I learn them and are they serving me, in a very overarching way. Whereas ayahuasca will, for me, was pointing at 1 or 2 things that I wasn't really understanding what she was saying. Ibogaine, and they call it a grandfather, had that more masculine, like, we're just going to take the whole thing down and start over. And that's what happened.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. And it's what I needed. It was like total ego. It wasn't total ego death. You can't say that, but it was pretty close to that.
It sounds like it was also tapping into kind of the no thought when, meditators can work their entire lives to actually silence the mind, the monkey mind, as the Buddha called it, So it's interesting how that just silenced it for you. And when silencing the mind was there was no anxiety.
I have a very clear, so it's funny, I guess I did have one thought. I had a visual of like an eagle flying through like this canyon of clear open sky in my brain.
Wow.
I know.
Well, what's so interesting, and we're going to get into this more later, is in the non-dual, so much of that practice is don't believe a thought. You're not your thoughts. There's something in this reality realm beyond thoughts when you step out of them. And it's amazing that I think iboga has the similar quality to it. And what some people are saying about ibogaine and iboga is it's a complete reset. All the patterns.
That's what it felt like.
Yeah.
I'm curious what your experience was. Was that similar for you?
Yes, my images and my experience was with iboga. So not a medical crew. Mine was more ceremonial experience, Bwiti music, Bwiti initiates, serving the medicine. Very much in relationship to the culture of Bwiti. So for me, even hearing that music for the first time, did they play Bwiti music? No. It was so jarring. And iboga can give you auditory hallucinations. Yes. It literally felt like there was somebody playing the flute or whatever those instruments are around me, beside me. I remember thinking that was crazy. Like I took my eye mask off and was like, I cannot believe there's not, musicians right here. It was different than yours in the sense that I saw not specific memories, but people. Like my father was in it, my brother was in it, I saw my mother in it, and then themes, but from like a huge distance. Mm-hmm. Like I didn't see myself like you were talking about ayahuasca. Ayahuasca had this more direct touching of me. Like I felt more emotional part of it. My body was engaged in it. With iboga, it was a little bit more, like you said, watching a movie, wondering, for me, I wasn't part of the movie. I didn't feel like I was in the movie, but it felt like I was more watching a movie that had deep importance to my life, what I didn't know, what I didn't see. And it was more after the experience. Like you said, you sat up and were clear. Mine was a little different. I laid there, very quietly, had not purged. And it wasn't really to the end where there was a kind of a realization that there was a lot for me to learn here and that there was a lot for me to let go of, that I started like purging. And then for a good hour, I felt I was purging like generations and things in my life that I wasn't even aware that I was purging. After that came that space of no thought. I just remember getting on the plane, returning home, and for weeks having this canvas of quiet, this background of like quiet. And then I think for me, it took a few years to truly understand what the iboga experience was teaching me about myself, about my patterns, about during the ceremony or that retreat, I was so uncomfortable. And it made me uncomfortable when certain patterns were coming up. Almost like, honestly, I felt like a little bit of like someone who like needed heroin, like a junkie. Like my patterns, iboga made me so uncomfortable. Like I felt like, oh my God, what is this? So then there was the realization that one of our greatest addictions is to our patterns and our thoughts. And so I think what it was making me realize was that I did have an addiction. I had an addictive way of being, patterns of behaviors and addictive thought patterns, which we all have. They just, if we really tap into our own mind, what do they say? We think 90,000, 80,000 thoughts a day, and 60% are the same as yesterday. So I was tapping into the thoughts that I had every day that were not serving me.
Yeah. It's interesting how it breaks addiction to heroin or opiates or to the thinking and the ego. Although I will say, as with all these medicines, you're like, I'm healed right afterward. And then the ego just like comes back on. So for me, it did. But I'd had that time away from it. There was like about probably 4 weeks of a very liminal space. And then as it came back on, I went back to working with ayahuasca. And Because the ego had gotten less dense from the iboga experience, when ayahuasca was showing me the things that she had been showing me prior to the ibogaine, I understood it more. I wasn't so like defended against seeing and hearing, and I let myself surrender more. I let the medicine go deeper, and the shame that was like holding me from looking at anything was like, you know what? Okay.
Right.
So I ended up doing an ayahuasca ceremony down in Mexico as part of the treatment, and had a night that was just like so much shame. And I was on the cliffs of the Pacific. That was where the center was. And I remember finding the shaman and like telling him, like, I think I'm going to just jump into the Pacific. I'm like, can you just send like an I'm sorry to everyone on my email list, anyone in my email, and I'm just going to walk over there. And he like held me. He was so beautiful. He was a Yaqui shaman, and he just held my hand, and he was like, no, he's like, now you know, like, welcome to like knowing. He's like, and you don't even need to apologize, just change. Now you see it, just be different now. And don't like go around like self-pitying or like apologizing to everyone, or, you know, like the self-pity is almost like, look at me, like more attention too. It's like, just, now you know. Now he'd seen it before, and I think he knew it with the minute he met me. He was like, oh, this girl, I know what we're going to do with her, or what the medicines are going to do with her. And so he was so happy that I kind of came to that place, and he talked to me for, I don't know, 3 hours till dawn that night, just being translated by one of the nurses who also was getting like a teaching from him, and then all the other people sort of started to come around by the end, and everyone was just hearing this, like, the shame. There's good shame, you know, of course, but then there's like too much shame. And I knew what I knew what I knew. I behaved the way I behaved. I tried so hard, but you know, I mean, living in New York, working in an incredibly pressure-filled world, being prescribed a lot of pills, part of the drinking culture of journalism and of New York in general, you know, just like drinking every night, living in these tiny apartments, like it just had disconnected me completely from myself. And he saw that, and he was so compassionate with me. And also I have a overdramatic side too that was like, I'm so bad. And he was like, okay, you're not that bad. You know, like there was that too, of the critic just being like very dramatic about how awful everything had been. And he was like, no, calm down a little. But then the best part was, after that ceremony, or maybe the next one, I don't remember exactly, ayahuasca told me that I needed to now serve, which of course I think is often the message you get from these medicines, is like, be of service. Mm-hmm. So I didn't know how to do that. And I'm at this clinic with all these people who need help. They're really hurting. So I immediately started helping, like aggressively, everyone in the clinic that like had never even talked to me before. Right. And they were kind of like, can you like go? I was like sound bowling for people, like offering people like to get them their food. And they were like, can you just like chill and not help me so much? So it was an amazing place to have like a total breakdown and then kind of break through. And then like, now I'm here to serve. And they were like, okay, cool, but just like take it a little easy on the helping. Right. And I became so close with all the people at the clinic. We laughed our asses off there. I didn't even tell my parents where I was. I didn't tell my family. I just was in Tijuana, like at a clinic on the middle of Rosarita, I think I was, on the like looking at the Pacific, just doing incredible healing work with a bunch of people who had very different lives than I did, but all ended up in the same place because we weren't connected to ourselves.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It was wild.
Because, you know, there you are with people struggling from heroin. You're coming from a different place. I'm coming from a different place. And yet the medicine seems to be in some ways doing the exact same things, which again ties a little bit to the non-dual path, which is coming back to true nature. You know, you were disconnected from your true nature. You were disconnected from your truth, your joy, your peace, your equilibrium, mostly due to thoughts and patterns that come from early conditioning and generational patterns. I was so disconnected from myself as a mother, as a woman. Again, you were in service, like, let me do bowls for you. Let me do this for you. Let me do that for you. I was like as a mother, the same way. Let me rescue you. Let me help you. Let me do that. And, you know, some of it was beautiful. Like you're just there to serve your family and your children. And yet at a time when there wasn't as much dialogue of not losing yourself in it, you know? And so there were aspects of myself that I had lost in that process. Like, who am I beyond this? You know? And in both of our experiences, like I know in mine, what Iboga was speaking to was coming back to like something so deep inside me that was lost, like in my decision making. I didn't even know it was lost. That's the amazing thing. I had no idea that I had kind of and it's so common today as we work with people we know, it's so common that, even shame, how back then what shame felt like, and it doesn't mean the sensation of shame feels any different today, but there's not that like, maybe I'll just jump here. Shame is one of the most intense emotions to feel. And it's a collective wound. It's a collective wound. So now if shame came up, it's like, you know how to hold it. You know what to do with it, ultimately just to feel it, to acknowledge it's actually part of the non-dual. Like it's like a portal into something deeper, something that connects us all.
Yeah, and it's like the people in the clinic were there because the discomfort was so great in their lives that heroin was the one place they felt good.
Yeah.
So they had become addicted to it. And then for me, I was unable to sit with shame. I mean, I don't even think I would have known to be ashamed at that point, but I was so uncomfortable with how my life was but I couldn't sit still with it. And I didn't even know to sit still with it. So I was constantly just distracting, going out with friends for drinks, online, Facebook, whatever, working my ass off, but not realizing like that I was doing it as a distraction. Just never taking that time to just go inward ever. I was 39 years old, and I don't think since a child I had done that. And no one I knew was doing it either. I didn't even know to do it. And I was in therapy, and I wasn't being guided to do that. So then the medicines, I think, and I'm curious what you think, like they sort of teach you how to sit with yourself and hold the shame, but with compassion, and how to sit with like, oh, how did that feel that I did that? Did I like it? Okay, I didn't love that I did that, but like, okay, I'll make it better.
Yeah, loving kindness.
And grief too, of course. Like there was a lot of grief that needed to purge, needed to be processed, and a lot of anger, which I'm, still in the process of all of that. But it was that lesson of just like sit with yourself and feel all of those feelings. I mean, that was when I started to be able to do that. And there was a lot I hadn't felt for a really long time.
I definitely not grew up meditating, but I had that experience at that school that I went to with the silent meetings every Friday where we sat in quiet. And that was a base to like my now practice, which I didn't even realize. And then even when I was a young mother, I would say that one of the things I remember having Katie, my first child, and thinking like that having a baby is such a window into the present moment because there's nowhere else to be. But like the touch, the foot, the bath, I remember feeling that first year of her life like I had entered into like a non-dual teaching of just presence, of what it meant to really be present. And then I think what Iboga did similar for you, you said after that you started to work with ayahuasca, and then that really started to change some things. Similarly, when I took Iboga, I didn't know I had anything to change. I didn't know I had patterns. I didn't know that you're just living your life. You come from your families, you come from the culture, you have your particular gender and those roles. And so I really had no idea I had anything to change until the utter discomfort that Iboga made me feel, like true discomfort. And so that made me really curious, like what's here that I don't see. And so mushrooms, ayahuasca, it really did. It's kind of the same thing. It kind of pulled me in. Like, you can either say no here, because we were talking about earlier, who's called to, on the first episode, who is called to this medicine? And then there's that question of who's called to continue, because there's some spots that are so truly uncomfortable. I mean, feeling existential shame is no joke. Like, tapping into that is really no joke. And also, even more so, I remember at the time, I had started to take a course called Being True to You. And I had met Dr. Dan Engel. So for anybody who hasn't listened to Dr. Dan Engel, he's episode number 3. Such an incredible wisdom teacher for me. And I remember one of the books that he recommended to me is a book that I now recommend to clients, which is The Drama of the Gifted Child. And that really felt like it. Yeah, I remember him saying, you might want to read this. And Being True to You is a training course for psychedelic integration coach for addiction and psychospiritual. So that's what I was learning how to do. And so I thought it would be brilliant to hire him and to have him teach me, because he was one of the best. And as he did, he would give me these little hintings like, this would be really good for your clients. You might want to read this book. And I was reading that book and I was like, oh my God, this is so about me. And it's that client that walks into your office, and we see it a lot. It's when the protector parts are so strong to protect the life that it grew up with, no matter what happened, like no matter what's back there. And even the subtleties of the little things that can affect a child, that can make a child feel shame, feel unworthiness, feel fear, like they're not safe in the world. So these medicines for me were like my first introductory to any of this. Like, I didn't know I had fear. I didn't know I had shame. I didn't know I had any anxiety. So it was a deeper exploration into like, who actually am I? Like, what's the full spectrum of emotion that I have no idea.
Yeah, and it's like, it is the sort of the path of bringing what's in the shadow and what's in the unconscious into the consciousness. And there's a lot of amazing things in the shadow, and there's a lot of really, oh, everyone else does that awful thing. But it's like, no, you do that awful thing, and you see it in everyone else because it's sitting there like in you, waiting for you to reclaim it and own it. And that's what a lot of, I would not have been able to have even done that without working with the medicine first. But then once you're on that path, then it's the kind of the days in between where you're making these deep realizations about the way you show up in the world, the way you treat yourself, the way you treat others.
I'm not crying. My eyes are just a little teary today.
That didn't make you cry? I'm going to. I'm going to make you cry.
Yeah.
It's a heartbreaking story.
Well, you and I were talking about this yesterday. It is a bit of a heartbreaking story in some ways. And I can say this with such deep compassion for my mother, my father, her father, generations past, and myself. It's so tragic. We were talking about yesterday. I was thinking of the ways in which fear has limited my life, the way certain patterns that do arise from childhood and generations, like, keep us from knowing our true nature, living from that authentic self. It is a bit of a tragedy. It's like both. It's like beauty and tragedy. And I think that's what for me, the medicine path is also like. Every journey has been like beauty and some bit of gritty shadow. And then I think in the non-dual, there's that saying, samsara is nirvana, like suffering is peace, heaven. Like I'm making duality in even those, but that they're really one thing,
Well, I think
co-arising.
what was, yeah, dependent on each other, to experience each of them. I think what started to become interesting too through working with different medicines is that a lot of it was like personal shadow work, I guess you would call it, like psychological excavation of my own psyche. But then at the same time, I was having, as many people who work with a lot of medicines do, deeply mystical experiences, a lot. And so while I was kind of doing the psychological and therapeutic work for myself, I was also on this other level being healed by like a knowing of, okay, it's a knowing and it's a not knowing because I don't know, but a sense of something greater. I'll say that, of something, and it's shifted over the years as to what that felt like. But it was kind of started to hold me as I was doing this really painful therapeutic work with myself, of seeing all these things I hadn't seen before, making conscious all the things that were unconscious. I was also being held in a new way by what I had thought was, I didn't think there was anything out there protecting us, holding us, guiding us.
Before you came into doing medicine work, did you have a faith? Did you believe in God? What was your...
No, I never really thought about it. I was raised Jewish, but I never gave it a lot of thought. And so, I just didn't have a spiritual nature,
right,
that I was conscious of. But it started unfolding in really funny ways, some of it. Like at first I was like, I will only wear boho dresses from Mexico because I'm so like hippie. Like, I was adopting all sorts of like, let me sing songs that I have no idea even what the language is, but like, This is what people sing in ceremony, like pulling, some would say cultural appropriation. I don't know. I meant it very respectfully. I just didn't have my own understanding of what my lineage meant. So I was like taking from those that I was, around. And as you can see, I've stopped with the boho dresses and the peasant, shirts and all that. But have kind of found my own path through that, which has changed a lot through the years. And I guess, so around this time, I started reading The Course in Miracles that I was introduced to by someone I was dating at the time, which is like a very hardcore non-dual tract, I would say. I don't know that I fully ever grasped The Course in Miracles, but I, was listening to like Marianne Williamson, teachers of it that were, guiding me through it.
And is it considered, because I read it years ago as well, and I mean, it radically shifts your thinking, and I definitely see it as a non-dual text. Is it referred to as a non-dual text? It is. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, it's slowly awakening you from the dream of separation. It's like slowly waking, you start with, this is not a chair, that is not, and it's pulling you out of the dream of it. But I didn't understand it. I was reading it, I was conceptually getting some of it, but I was like, it was just too
radically different. I mean, I think that's an important thing to highlight because, again, coming into medicine space, knew nothing. I couldn't even pronounce ayahuasca when I was like called to medicine. And then you start listening and you start to understand. You start to read a book like A Course in Miracles that is telling you to look at a chair and say, that's not real. That's not real. That's not real. That's radical.
Yeah. Well, so what was funny is I'm sitting there reading, it's like, 800 pages and very dense, and it's actually quite simple to understand if you actually, anyway, you could argue either way. And I get introduced, we're kind of going through like different medicines, and I get introduced through various people to someone who served 5-MeO. And at this point, I'm like, yeah, sure, what's next? Like, I was taking anything, anytime, just all in an effort of like, I'm
anywhere, any place, anytime,
any cost. I'm like, I don't know if you're like legitimate or not. Like, I don't care. which, by the way, viewers, do not do this. Do not follow in this path. But someone.
And why? Just highlight why.
Oh my God, it's so dangerous.
Yeah.
I didn't happen to have that wound of like falling under the spell of some shady shaman. Like that was not going to happen to me. So it didn't. And I thank God was safe in all of this. But I was definitely with some people that could have been taken advantage of if that was their wound. It would have. These are some interesting characters I met. Yeah. And then I met some really, really beautiful people too. So kind. And I was in I had been in the Western medicine, Western psychiatry, like the very best New York City had to offer. Great insurance, like totally, here's what Pfizer tells you to do for this. Here's what J&J wants you to take for that. Gone to Harvard Medical, whatever. Now I'm in this like shadowy underworld of mental health care, which is like, I took a breathwork course. Or like, yes, my whole lineage has been serving ayahuasca for generations. But I didn't know and I didn't care. I just was like, I will take anything, pretty much. But so I was offered to work with 5-MeO, and I show up not really knowing what to expect. And, essentially it's a pipe that you vaporize the medicine, and it's lightning fast. And
So for anybody also that doesn't know what 5-MeO is, it is the molecule it's found in seeds, barks, other plants, mostly found in the culture that were around in the Bufo alivarius toad, and also known as the Colorado River toad. And this is also described as the God molecule because it's an experience that some will experience an ego disillusionment. So just to put that out there for anybody that doesn't know what 5-MeO DMT is.
Yeah, so I inhaled it and completely dissolved into like, there was all the other medicines, there's like a witness and a subject, you can kind of observe what's happening to some extent. And with this one, I was gone and I was just purely energetic, and it felt like love. And it was terrifying because I had total ego death. I mean, that's how I would say it was. And then became just energy, and then came back. And I was like, okay, that's what the Course in Miracles is. Like, I had direct experience of that non-dual state that the Course in Miracles had been guiding me to. So it wasn't conceptual or something I was trying to like cram in my brain and understand from a thinking Stefanie place. Right. I was it, which even words are hard to use. I mean, I wasn't it. There was no I to be it. I can't explain it exactly, and anyone that's had that experience won't understand. But
it's kind of what so many of the faith traditions have been pointing to in different language: Hinduism, Taoism, Buddhism. If you look at Christ consciousness as one of the same teachings.
It was just a huge life-changing experience to realize truly what I am is that energetic field. Mm-hmm. So then, and I'm curious about your experience with it, because I know also it kind of leads us to where we are now, which is shifting from a little bit of the deep, deep psychedelic work to more of the non-dual.
Yeah.
So what was your experience with DMT, 5-MeO?
Well, it was so fun meeting you there along the path, because Stefanie and I met while you were assisting a woman who was teaching a training program for people to do the integration work. So it was a pretty intensive program, and it really piqued my interest for 5-MeO DMT. And when I finally did have my experience with 5, I mean, I don't think there's anything that I could describe that's like it. In particular, that first experience, going from like human in my mind with all my conditioning, my family conditioning, my religious conditioning as a human being, conditioned as a body, conditioned to see the world as in the way that the mind sees this 3D reality that we know is being interpreted by the visual cortex and thought. And so suddenly I show up like that, and I was like, whoa, 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 It's like this fractal light. I can sense as I'm surrendering the parts of myself that are like, whoa, whoa, trying to let go. And then the complete disillusionment and feeling. I just remember feeling that every time I agreed to surrender more, it was like deeper dissolve into what I felt was love too. And then I surrender more. And it was like, whew, more love, more love. And then coming back, I had the similar experience of no thought. So I remember coming back and seeing trees and seeing the river and feeling like there was nothing, there's no thought needed. I mean, just so incredibly beautiful. And I think it was like a deeper understanding of what unconditioned love is. I didn't have to do anything. I didn't have to heal my shame. I didn't have to be this or this or this. I didn't even have to be Michaela and all the things that Michaela tries to do, and I didn't have to, all I had to do was surrender, show up. That was incredible.
It's such a beautiful medicine.
And like you said, it was suddenly the visceral experience of that which we are all seeking. I mean, when we think of our deep wounds, collective wounds as humans, it really is the wound of separation. I heard someone talking yesterday about the belief that, even when the umbilical cord is cut, that first separation from the mother, that it somehow creates this level of coming into this 3D reality where there is trauma. That's what it's called, suffering, whatever it is, separation, all the same words, And so it was suddenly like, it's hard to describe, but no separation, no seeking, no desire, no resistance, no separation.
Yeah, and I think, more or less from that point, my path has been, I still have, deep therapeutic work that I do and love, and it's very healing. It's very healing. And my meditation practice sort of became different because I had that experience and I knew how to get there again, not exactly the same. There was still a self that was meditating, but it became easier and easier for my awareness to not be like always behind my own eyes, to shift into different places and to unbind a little bit. Mm-hmm. And so it's been more and more and more of that. And it's been so not even fun, deeply profound, really, and fun to have someone that I can, we have our own little sangha, you and I, of these practices, and we found our teacher who we love.
Favorite teachers.
Angelo, who's taught us so much, and my friend Tim, who really exposed me to all of this first, who had an awakening and even let me know it was humanly possible. I thought it was for Buddha and, ascended beings. I didn't know it was possible for normal
all of us
people. Yeah. And, seeing him go through it, and then he introduced me to Angelo. And then suddenly, all these texts that I had been reading started to make more sense. And then it was like, well, stop reading, just be it, and go deeper and deeper into these meditative states. And so it's interesting how the psychedelic path has led me kind of, in some sense, less psychedelics and more just meditation and
yeah. How would you define non-dual for someone who's out here and they're like, what are they talking about?
Mm-hmm. So non-dual means not two, and two would be I and that. So
subject, object.
Subject and the object. So Stefanie is observing the world around her. But what the teachings of Buddhism and Advaita and other traditions, I don't want to say exactly because I'm not exactly sure that all of them are non-dual, but teach that there is not two, all is one, that it's all consciousness. And I could be using the wrong words too. It's very hard to have the right words with these, topics, but that it's all consciousness, it's all awareness. We are it. There is no I, there is no you, there is no separation. I am you, you are me. It's just consciousness or source or God or whatever you want to call it. Chi, there's many terms for it, just observing itself through separation, and that it's just energy. And so I had experienced that on the 5-MeO medicine. And, it's very hard to be sitting across from you right now and be like, that's me. But it gets easier to sort of have that at least awareness that that's what's happening, and to what one of my teachers, Locke Kelly, calls have glimpses of it throughout the day to bring you back into, it actually isn't that hard with you. Like right now that I'm staring at you.
We just, as we're talking about it, the space is shifting.
Yeah, exactly. How would you describe it like that?
Okay. I almost think non-dual, the phrase doesn't work because non-dual implies two. It's an experience that is ineffable, indescribable. It's unity beyond like our mind's comprehension. It's a state of oneness beyond anything we can truly comprehend. And so you mentioned some of the teachers. You mentioned Angelo, so that's Dr. Angelo DeLula, for anybody who doesn't know. And we had a great conversation with him. We happened to be in Colorado and met up with him, and he was so generous with his time. And one of the things, if anybody's interested in this, is like, it's having those pointings, because I had meditated for years. I'd never really understood non-duality. I got to peaceful places, I got to samadhi, but I had no what they would say is a change in my perceptual field or real change in identity of me as a separate self living among subjects and objects, trying to get my needs met, resisting, desiring.
Referencing everything through you.
Through me.
Everything is a reference to Stefanie as in the teachings in the non-dual.
As the subject of your life.
I'm observing everything. I'm having a reaction to everything. I'm feeling everything. And not only that, but my mind is interpreting everything for me which is kind of funny, like as if you need your mind to tell you, oh, the wind feels good. Right. Oh, that's blue. Oh, Michaela's voice is in my ear. Like the mind takes over that role, but it isn't needed for me to drop into experience another level deeper and experience sound as sound, sight as sight, touch as touch, feeling as sensation. I don't need to interpret it for myself. So that's one of the ways I would describe non-dual as well, is taking the thinking, the narration, the constant narration of the mind drops away, eventually.
Yeah.
But then what's cool is that now in our work with clients, it fits into the therapeutic work because it's like on a spectrum. Like at first, as we've been describing in these past 2 episodes, you're operating through conditioning, through parts, in the internal family systems and other systems, that's called parts work. Different parts of us that are acting certain ways to try to get our needs met. And at first you're like totally covered in parts. And then as you start to work with them and they start to calm down a little bit, what comes through is that non-dual nature. Right. So eventually the other end of the spectrum is that source energy or consciousness, unbound consciousness, whatever you want to call it, which also is healing. So we're working at it from both ends, and that is the natural course of things in my and your view, I think, of healing.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because, it does seem like there's this pathless path, right? That we come in somehow to this 3D reality. There is wounding. No one is going to come to this planet and not have some wounding, conditioning. I think it's fascinating to think that even my reality how I see the world through Michaela's interpretation of the world, like my interpretation of the world from what I came from and everything isn't reality. It's just my mind's interpretation. So it's when that mind drops away, there's something else there that's beyond mind that we get to experience ourself as.
And it's so incredibly peaceful.
So peaceful. The other thing that is so important is the not bypassing, right? So these aspects of ourselves that we all run away from, shame, fear, anxiety, resisting, desiring this, resisting that, is the very, is like the thing that causes our suffering. And so when I think of non-duality, I think of the end of suffering, really stepping into a space that is infinite time, not separate. And as you know, because you're here, but I want to like certainly clarify this to the audience, like I am not there. Like I have a lot of solidities, as they call them, and parts of myself that I'm still refining and, shattering and learning. And there's still...
And you are there.
And I am there. That's the other thing. We all are. We all are. Like right now, it's the closest possible thing to you. So I guess I would leave like the audience with this, because I know we're wrapping up. But
because in the relative world, I have to catch a flight.
Right, exactly. Is who were you before you were born? That's a question, an inquiry that you could start asking. Like, who were you before you were born? Who are you? What is this? Really begin to notice how quickly the mind comes on to filter, even like when you touch your fingers, like the mind's like, oh, that feels good. But move closer into just the sensation and notice what begins to happen. And I heard from Josh Putnam the other day an incredible piece of wisdom that was, listen. I was speaking of like my children, and he said, listen to them until you become them. It's like that kind of listening that dissolves all the filters in the way. Any last thoughts for you?
No. Mm-hmm. No, thank you so much.
Yeah, so good to see you.
Oh my gosh.
Now it's time for you to leave and catch a plane. And
it's also... it is
going nowhere.
Yeah.
Going nowhere.
Everything is just, pure presence as much as we can.
And also I loved this too, that there's no noun. There's just arising. So what's arising is the end of the show.
Arising is my shuttles outside.
Right now. Okay.